It's Friday again, and we are talking about how to cultivate resiliency in children. And we're thinking about this in terms of F words. And so the first F word that we explored was foundation, how important foundation is to cultivating resiliency. And then last week we talked about family. And today we're going to talk about my least favorite F word, failure. Failure. I can almost stand any F word, but failure. But a failure is part of the process. We witness our children's failures and we witness our own failures as parents. And the important piece about failure is that we create a generous, remember we talked about the generosity of foundation. And we talked about how family is that connectedness, that staying connected no matter what is happening. And when we have those two, we have a place that is safe for failure. One of the most important pieces that we can do as parents is own up to our failures with our children. That we go to them when we fail and we seek reconciliation. And by the way, we seek reconciliation on the child's terms when they are ready to reconcile. And that we allow ourselves some grace and generosity, and we're kind to ourselves as we sort of come up against our failures. So how do we do that? Well, one is that we inhabit and practice the spiritual practice of confession. And confession can be sort of a scary word, but can we just take it down to get a little bit more earthy with the word confession? It just means to tell the truth about ourselves. And when we confess, when we say our sorries, we always need to hold the truth about ourselves that we know, and also the truth about what God tells us. We hold those two things together and we do not separate them. So that foundational piece where God's way is generous and that we belong in love's family is not shaken by our confession. The truth that we may tell about ourselves always is held next to our sense of being the beloved of God. So when our children fail, that they can see that we have held ourselves in our failures in that light, and we help them to hold themselves in that light when they fail as well. And a second way that failure can be a helpful F word for cultivating resiliency is we need to learn to plan B it. Cultivating the idea that alternatives are just as good. You know, in Mark chapter 8, Jesus goes in to heal a blind man. And he starts out and he spits and we rub the stuff and he puts it on the blind man's eyes. And then he asks the blind man, so what do you see? And he says, oh, something kind of like trees. And then Jesus does another thing. You see, Jesus knew how to plan B it. Jesus knows how to plan B it. So how can we begin to let go of this idea that one, perfection is what we're after? Can I just maybe quote my friend Lynn Holt, that perfection is the enemy of the good? And that plan B, it is just as good as plan A. So again, let's go back to the two things that really help us with the term failure. One is that we are vulnerable to stay connected through confession and reconciliation. We are vulnerable enough during our failures, maybe the ones we have in parenting, maybe in real life, to share a bit with our work life, to share a bit with our children about that, so they can see that we hold our failures in the foundational generosity of belonging to God. And maybe also that we cultivate that connection, that reconciliation with them. And then the second is that we learn to plan B it. That we learn to hold plan B as high as plan A. And maybe it's we're in the middle of COVID right now. I'm like on plan Y at this point. But there's just an infinite number of ways when we are thinking about a generous God, that God will pull it off. I love this term that that flight, like pilots and flight advisors often use. It's called a goat rodeo. And it's this idea that everything can be going totally not as planned, maybe even feels like totally wrong, and it comes together right at the end. That's a goat rodeo. So maybe we could think of this as we think of the F word that I personally dislike the most, failure. That actually in God's kingdom, failure's a goat rodeo.